Hey 3M guys and gals, John coming to you directly from my office here at home in Aarhus, and I want to talk to you about the idea of the park being a microcosm in our short story, The Park. Microcosm basically means like the world in miniature, and the idea here is that you could interpret the park as having a symbolism being kind of a picture of South African life at the time the story was written in miniature. So if the park is a symbol of South African life in miniature, how does that work? We need to go through a few different steps here. Let's start with the boy, our protagonist here in the story, the main character. We're told quite early on that he was put out of the park earlier prior to the present tense of this story. It's on page 80, line 12. And this is a parallel to Adam and Eve being ejected from paradise. But it could also be interpreted as being a parallel to the blacks being exiled from their tribal lands and then relegated to scheduled areas and townships like we talked about in our work with background material. And how does the boy see the park now, at this point in the story? Well, the park is, I guess you could say, the stuff of dreams for him. He calls it Never Never Land on the bottom of page 81, lines 43 to 44. And later on when he is at home, but thinking back to or dreaming of being in the park, he talks about being away from the narrow streets. That's on page 85, line 25. More than just being the stuff of dreams, this is also the province of the pales. The park is where the white people hang out, because only they are allowed there. That's on page 81, line 32. And it's definitely, or he feels at least, that's definitely a place where he does not belong. As he says on the top of 84, lines 5 to 6, he thinks of the park as what was denied him. And I could argue that this is the same kind of feeling that black South Africans must have felt about the prospect of equality and rights in their own land, something that was being denied them, something that was something they could only dream about, something that the whites controlled. Moreover, the park is described as a place of colors in this story. We hear about the bright red and green tubing of the park. That's on page 81, lines 42 to 43. And it's contrasted with the shabby gray home he lives in, where the paint is kind of faded away. It's on page 84, lines 32 to 33. So what this idea of the park being a microcosm of South African life at the time, what it kind of means is that we think, it's also underlined by the fact that the park is protected. There's a kind of a microcosmic symbolism in that as well. The park is protected by the railings. That's the first protection we meet. It divides the boy from the black boy from the white boys inside playing. And those railings are described as being tall, towering above his head on page 84, lines 10 to 11. It's also protected by the attendant who kicks him out again at the very start of the story. And that attendant is driven against his own, as it says on page 88, line 27. So pushed to eliminate or to keep his own people, the blacks, out of this playground by the system. And the main character, the protagonist, even implies that if the attendant calls the police on him at the end of the story, he's going to be punished by the police. So he's, even if he doesn't, if he doesn't perform what his protective duties, he's going to be punished by the police. And it's also protected by a changing guard of the white people. At the start of the story, it's babysitters and children. Later on, it's the old men sitting there holding up their stomachs on page 83, lines 36 to 39. But lastly, and most importantly perhaps, it is protected by the notice board, where it says whites only. And that notice board is described as like a ghostly shadow hanging over the park at the very end of the story. And that, I think, could be argued to be a symbolic parallel to all those rules that were set down by the apartheid system to exclude blacks from areas that the whites wanted to have to themselves. Lastly, there is another parallel here, that the world of Merrim's house, the white woman for whom our protagonist's mother works and does that laundry. When he goes to that house, there's also a very clear division between two different worlds. And even the black people in that world are wearing stiff white clothing, the black servant that he meets, to kind of emphasize the fact that this is not their world. They have to be almost disguised to be a part of this world. And then there's the dog that guards that house, the old lap dog, who is described as having blunt teeth on page 82. So he's not really dangerous. And one might argue that this is James Matthews' comment on the white regime. Maybe they are like this old lapdog. They aren't really dangerous anymore to the blacks. If the blacks were to decide to revolt, they might actually succeed. So that was a quick look at the idea of the park being a microcosm, a mini world or a mini version of South African life at this time, in the story The Park by James Matthews.